Hello. All right. Welcome to our lunch break discussion. Today is Wednesday, May 26th, and we are blessed to have Rabbi Joe Schwartz, who is joining us from Tel Aviv, where I think it's 10 o'clock at night. So we want to thank Rabbi Schwartz for joining us. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what's going on in Israel, the nature of how Americans talk about Israel, how Jewish Americans talk about Israel. Maybe we'll get into a little bit about the divide between American Jewry and Israel Jewry, and a little bit about how we can really facilitate a healthy conversation between Israel, between America, and between Jews with many different viewpoints. So before we start, for those of you who are new to our Wednesday lunch break special, great to see you. Really happy to have you here. You're welcome to join us any Wednesday at noon. For those who are the regulars, I see you here too. You guys know we ask hard questions here. We don't shy away from challenging questions. We are trying to achieve a level of depth here with our community. And as a result of that, sometimes we bring up hot button issues, and the only requirement is that people remain polite. That's pretty much the only requirement that we have as a community. Politeness is required, but disagreement is welcome. And we ultimately, my vision for our community is a community that can sit with people who disagree with each other, and one that we can still come together as Jews and as a community. So we're blessed to have Rabbi Schwartz here with us. A little bit of a background about Rabbi Schwartz I just want to share with you before we start. Rabbi Schwartz and I got to know each other when we were both living just a few blocks from each other in Brooklyn. He is a native of New York City. While in rabbinical school, he served as the first rabbinic intern at The Kitchen, which is an innovative Jewish-based community here in San Francisco. After ordination, he served in the pulpit for 3 years in New York City. And since 2019, he has been at work at a project that aims to connect diaspora Jewry and Israel and Israelis via culture. So do it through culture. So last August, Rabbi Joe and his family made Aliyah to Tel Aviv. He is also a graduate of Columbia College, NYU Law School. So we're both lapsed attorneys, and he received his ordination at the University of Judaism, the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. And if you're interested, I just want to post up here for anybody who might want to read a little bit of his account that he wrote up on how he made to Israel. That is on our website, but I'm putting that into the chat. Now, before we start the conversation here, I just want to frame it just a little bit about where we find ourselves here. And I have a text that we've studied here. It comes from pretty much the founder of our movement, Solomon Schechter, and it comes from 1906. So the text is 115 years old, and I'm going to read it because in reading what Joe is writing and what Joe has been doing publicly, especially since he made his Aliyah, he really sounds like Solomon Schechter to me. That's quite, there you go, Joe. You're just like Schechter. No big setup there. But where he is going, I think, is to really back to where conservative Judaism has always aspired to be, and where we aspire to be at the community. So let's just take a look at Schechter's words. And this is from 1906. It is from 100 years ago. So he writes, to me personally, after long hesitation and careful watching, Zionism recommended itself. He's really in 1906 figuring out where does he stand on Zionism. He says Zionism recommended itself as the great bulwark against assimilation. By assimilation, I do not understand what is usually understood by Americanization, namely that every Jew should do his best to acquire the English language, that he should study American history and make himself acquainted with the best productions of American literature and law, so on and so forth. Rather, what I understand by assimilation is loss of identity, or that process of disintegration, which passing through various degrees of defiance of all Jewish thought and of all disloyalty to Israel's history and its mission, terminates variously in different lands. So in Germany, for instance, it ends in direct and public apostasy, and in other countries where this pressure has been removed, Schechter writes, it results in the severance of all affiliation with the synagogue. All right, so he goes on here a little bit. And he says, ultimately, what we do is that it's followed by a sort of eclectic religiosity that coquettes with various churches, not neglecting even Christian Science. And he says here, he's quoting from Wellhausen, after giving Spinoza's oft-quoted view regarding the possibilities of the absorption of Israel by its surroundings, he writes that the persistency of the race may, of course, prove a harder thing to overcome than Spinoza has supposed. But nevertheless, he will be found to have spoken truly in declaring that the so-called emancipation of the Jews must inevitably lead to the extinction of Judaism, wherever that process is extended beyond the political to the social sphere. And so Schechter writes, it is this kind of assimilation with the terrible consequences indicated that I dread most, even more than pogroms. To this form of assimilation, Zionism, in the sense defined, will prove, Zionism in the sense defined will prove and is already proving a most wholesome check. Whatever faults may be found with its real or self-appointed leaders, Zionism as a whole forms an opposing force against the conception of the destiny of Israel and the interpretation of its mission, the leading thought of which is apparently the well-known epigram, whosoever shall seek to gain his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. He's quoting Jesus. Zionism declares boldly to the world that Judaism means to preserve its life by not losing its life. It shall be a true and healthy life with a policy of its own, a religion wholly in its own, invigorated by sacred memories and sacred environments, and proving a tower of strength and of unity, not only for the remnant gathered within the borders of the Holy Land, but also for those who shall by necessity or choice prefer what is now constitutes as the diaspora, the galut, right? So in reading, isn't that powerful, Joe? So
I wish you would, I need to read that more carefully. That was extraordinary. And just as you said, you introduced me as saying, sort of following in its footsteps, you do me tremendous honor, but I have to say that I resonated with that tremendously.
So in reading your work, I thought that you might, because I think you come out of this strain and stream of conservative Judaism, and I think appeal to the best of our impulses. But I want to talk a little bit now that we've sort of set the stage here for who you are. So you grew up on the Upper East Side. You went to Dalton, that much I know, right? And then you went to Columbia College and NYU Law School. So tell us a little bit, I guess, about your Jewish upbringing, law school, and then how you ended up becoming a rabbi.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. I want to just make one apology in advance, which is that I'm now on my iPhone, and I hope there won't be technical glitches. Let's hope it works out. So as you said, I grew up on the Upper West and Upper East sides of Manhattan, and my home was somewhere between conservative and reform, closer to reform, without that much living Jewish memory within it. We had a lot of respect for Judaism, a lot of sense of loyalty to Judaism, but not that much living knowledge, with the exception of our seders, which were full, and complete seders. And I found both boring when I was young and then increasingly fascinating and compelling because they were so different from everyday life. I became bar mitzvah at a Reform synagogue, which I really disliked tremendously. And I particularly disliked this feeling that I was always kind of kept at arm's length from understanding Judaism, that it was, for example, we were taught to decipher Hebrew, but not really to read Hebrew. And I had a sort of a moment in my first year of college when my grandfather passed away. And I felt with him, the last link to real Jewish knowledge was broken. And I had to do something about that. And partly because the seders were so important to me, and we did a lot of the seders in Hebrew, and I had such a hard time reading Hebrew because I didn't know the language. I was just deciphering the letters. I thought, well, the way to make this my own is to learn the language. I don't know what I believe. I don't know where my loyalties lie, but if I know the language, I can make it my own. And I took a year off from college and I went to Israel. I had been given a very minimal Jewish education, so I had no picture of Israel to measure my experience against. It was totally, a blank slate for me. And I went to Israel only to do Ulpan, which is their intensive Hebrew program. And I went to a kibbutz for half a year where I learned Hebrew, began to learn Hebrew. And when I came back, it's fair to say that I was changed. Wasn't particularly changed politically. I don't think I became a Zionist when I was in Israel, but having access to Hebrew meant that I could begin to become my own interpreter in Judaism. So sitting in synagogue, my father at this point had begun to go to a conservative synagogue. Sitting in synagogue was different. I now understood the Siddur, the prayer book, and I started to think and I started to explore. I ended up majoring in college in Hebrew and in Greek, and I had this kind of love affair with Hebrew that followed me for a long time. As Dan said, I was a lawyer before I became a rabbi, but it was the Hebrew that sort of that kept me connected to Jewishness during those long years. And finally, in my mid 30s or early 30s, really, I decided I cared enough about my Jewishness to want to make it a vocation. I still was not terribly affiliated with any Jewish community. My Judaism was much more intellectual than communal. But I wanted to learn a lot more, and I wanted to take it a lot more seriously. I began rabbinical studies in the Reform movement at HUC, which I also found dissatisfying, and I ended up transferring, as Dan said, to the conservative movement, to the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies in Los Angeles. And I also did a year at JTS, where you, Dan, were ordained.
Did you have a political point of view? I mean, throughout, I mean, at Ziegler, what was the relationship to Israel, I guess, and sort of your growing relationship to the state?
That's interesting. I can tell you that when I applied to Ziegler, my essay that was about my relationship to Israel gave the admissions committee pause. They didn't think it was Zionist enough. And we had to discuss it a little bit. It's hard to sort of reconstruct where I was then politically exactly, except that I had a very strong, and this goes to a word that showed up in Schefter, a kind of a strong Gestalt, Kishka's sense of connectedness with the Jewish people wherever they are. So my bond with Israel wasn't necessarily political. It wasn't about identifying with the political movement of Zionism. It was more, this is a major Jewish project with half the Jewish population within it, speaking a Jewish language, and therefore sort of perforce, like necessarily, I'm bound up with it, and it claims me.
So let's move to COVID a little bit now. So you're living in Brooklyn, and COVID breaks out, and I'm sure that was horrific, the experience
For everybody.
Brooklyn during that time. And you write about your relationship with your wife and the decision to make Aliyah. So could you just share a little bit about how COVID happens and then what happens in your family life after that?
Yeah, let me back up. COVID is one thing. There's really two causes. I mean, one thing is that, Hebrew and engagement with Hebrew had been so meaningful for me in my own Jewish upbringing that I'm somewhat evangelical about, getting American Jews to engage with Hebrew. Even if they don't become fluent, I just find it so valuable. And in particular, I've been so compelled by the way that Israeli culture is in dialogue with Jewishness in all these fascinating ways. So I've been working for a long time on a project, which you mentioned at the beginning, to sort of bring American Jews and Israeli Jewish culture together in interesting ways. And I had discovered in our little corner of Brooklyn, how much resistance there was, to Hebrew. It wasn't just, we don't know it and therefore it's alienating. It's that there were some that were very engaged and very curious, but there was a young contingent of people who were really kind of affirmatively hostile. And the hostility flowed from a political place that I did not have firsthand experience of, in my own generation. It was somewhat new. So I was growing somewhat frustrated with this sort of resistance I encountered and with my understanding of what was happening identity-wise within Brooklyn.
Did you find that in San Francisco when you were here? Or was it a different type of resistance? Was that about an era in time, maybe?
It's a good question. I didn't really. I mean, we can talk about my experience at the kitchen, and the kitchen was identified with the left of the political spectrum, in terms of Zionism. The New Israel Fund, the head of the New Israel Fund was the president of the kitchen. But but there was a lot of interest in Zionism. No, I think there was really a sea change. I was working at the kitchen, I believe, in 2012, and already by 2015, 2016, there was a serious change in what was happening in the Jewish community. Some of this was stimulated by the Gaza war in 2014, which is also when the group, If Not Now, emerged. There was a big shift that started to happen. No, the resistance, the hostility, and the kind of the sense that it was a live wire that was more dangerous than ever was new then. But this just gives a little bit of background to
that must have made a project. That must have made a project to unify Jews in Israel and Jews in America complicated.
It was, and there's many things were happening. Trump election was another thing. As you said in the beginning, of the way the kind of synagogue you want to create, Dan, is one in which people can radically disagree about important issues, but still be in relationship on the condition that they be polite to one another, which is what you said.
Amen.
And that's a liberal faith that radical disagreement doesn't need to shatter community. And that in fact, radical disagreement can be the bedrock of community, which I held. I'm not sure I still hold that belief, but I did. And it's also the kind of Torah that we learned. This is very much the kind of the way that at least I was taught Talmud. Talmud is clashing voices that radically disagree with one another, but find a kind of a community in machloket, in disagreement. It's a noble vision of community. So
what happened? So what happened around 15, 16, 17, and how did you end up in Israel?
Right. So I'm sorry, that was a long introduction. So
That's
there
okay.
was growing frustration on the one hand with what I was seeing in the Jewish community. And then came COVID. And on a very, very pragmatic level, what happened with COVID for us, we have two children, one of whom then was in first grade, very sensitive, very bright kid, but rigid in all sorts of ways. And as soon as school got shut down, things emotionally with him got very, very bad. We were really, really having a hard time in the house. He was cursing us. He was kicking. He was behaving just in really very, very disturbing ways. And then because we were all in the house together, I myself was being sucked into all sorts of dynamics that were not good. It was just a very hairy scene. And we didn't really know what to do with ourselves. It was March, it was April. Come May, my wife, who has a kind of an Israelephilia, was keeping an eye on Israel. And if you may remember that in Israel, there was a shutdown as well. But then in May, there was a reopening of schools. And she took stock of what was happening in the house. She said, you know what? I don't think right now America's going to get its act together to reopen schools this year or come September. And what I'm seeing right now in Israel is that they are going to get the schools open. So I think we should try to go to Israel just for the year, just for the year to see how it happens. It then turned out the only way to get into the country was to be a citizen. And the only way to be a citizen is to make Aliyah. So on a very sort of pragmatic basis, it's all tribute to my wife, did everything she could to get us citizens, to avail ourselves of the right of return and get citizenship, so as to get my son in particular enrolled in school. That was May. Then May 25th, last year, which was my birthday, it was just my birthday yesterday, George Floyd, of course, was killed. May his memory be a blessing. And from my perspective, things in America started to go really crazy. I'm sort of alone in seeing it, and in my peer set is seeing it as a sort of a madness as opposed to an awakening. But we can get into that. But I started to feel a sense of kind of tremendous dismay at a number of events that were happening in the American landscape. And at that point, we were already kind of on our way. Our petition to be let into Israel was accepted. We had rented an apartment here. We had found the right school district. We finally got here at the end of August so that my son could start school on September 1st with everybody else. And I had a bit of a political, kind of a personal political upheaval over the course of that long summer, watching events unfold in America and feeling a sense of growing estrangement and seeing in particular, trends and, currents that I had been already witnessing happening under the surface, kind of, jump up into the air. And so it was kind of a multi-factored process of making Aliyah. We still are here right now on an experimental basis, but I think it's fair to say now, we've been here for 9 months or so, 10 months, that we're here to stay. Various things that we've seen unfold in America, and mostly the sense of tremendous wellness and happiness that the whole family has living here in Israel has made us think that this is a permanent thing.
Thank you, Joe. I want to ask you, I have a couple of questions, then I'm going to open it up to everybody here. Yeah, I think you're describing your experience from last summer is a lot what I've been talking about and experiencing with some of my congregants here in San Francisco, which is just a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance that exists in the heart and the minds of some of my congregants and myself, which is how do we reconcile these beliefs? How do we understand what's going on in Israel? How do we process this when we love Israel, we love justice, and our minds are now dafuk because we can't figure it out so there's a real life dissonance that is happening here for some people, not for everyone, but certainly for some. So how did you process? I mean, so you had that dissonance a year ago, it sounds like, where you found that people who you thought maybe were supportive what happened? I guess, can you explain? I'm being vague because I want to be as vague as possible. But I mean,
well, Dan, help me understand. The dissonance you're talking about is between what and what, so I can address.
For example, there is, if your favorite talk show hosts that you agree with, and he's been slamming everyone that you hate in American politics, and then he slams the state of Israel, it creates a lot of dissonance for people. And when, they read the New York Times and they have a hard time making sense of the articles in the New York Times versus all of the other articles that they might agree in that paper, it creates a sort of dissonance. That's what I mean by that. And then there are friends who have loved them and supported them and shared Shabbat dinners with them, no longer accept their friendship or their POV. I know that there are 16-year-olds who are inundated on Instagram with messages that they just don't know how to respond to. And just like, take a look at this image right here. This comes from Facebook. I know it's not Tuesday, but today I experienced it first. A writer with a project I was hoping to edit turned down working with me and blocked my email address because, as he put it, BDS babe, I am Jewish. I live near Tel Aviv. He must have looked carefully at my website to see where I live. So we have this canceling of Zionist opinions and, in some cases, in the worst anti-Semitic cases, of Jews. So, and I think we're trying to make sense of that. So if you have any wisdom, I'm open to hearing it.
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct about it. And as I said, I do recommend the piece that I wrote, because there I think I articulated as best I could what I thought was both happening and what I predicted would be happening in short order with regard to Israel. I mean, what happened over last summer did not concern Israel in any particular, any overt way.
I'm interested in the George Floyd stuff. I'm interested because you write that essay rather passionately that a year ago, after what happens, and you talk about the whiteness, Jews folding into whiteness. You talk about the danger of that. If you could speak to.
Okay, let me frame it this way. There, on the left-hand side of the American political spectrum, there are really two camps that I think we're not always aware of their distinctness. There is what used to be the larger camp was the liberal camp, right, to which I belonged, and liberalism, as we define it, can be defined in lots of different ways. But one of it is a sort of, you might call it a sort of a, first of all, there's an optimism in it, which is that people are reachable by argument and reason fundamentally, and that we have that in common with one another. Everybody is a rational actor to some degree and can be reasoned with. Liberalism also is tolerant of serious disagreements, and not just disagreements about, small areas, but really radical disagreements. Part of what I find, beautiful about the liberal ethos is that you can have people that have really fundamental disagreements about how they see the world, but they can find ways to cooperate together in a shared society. But still somewhat a leftward side of the spectrum. Then further to the left, there's another group And they go by different names. It could be progressives, it could be leftists. Somewhat disparagingly now it's called wokesters or wokeness. It's a very and there are obviously fine distinctions within that, and many people belong to different camps within there. But within that camp, one unifying feature is certainly less tolerance for the right-hand side of the spectrum. That is a refusal to want to live in a shared society or break bread or make common cause with people that they think are morally on the wrong side of things, right? It's a much more rigid sense of right and wrong. It also in America increasingly is based on race and other identitarian characteristics. So there's a whole kind of, it's not just that you're a rational actor, it's that you belong to a particular identity group and that your role within the political spectrum has a great deal to do with what identity group you belong to. And then within the particular flavor of it that kind of welled up with Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd, murder, there's a program, and the program was announced 4 years earlier in the Ferguson protest riots, when the movement for Black Lives came out with a platform which laid out its worldview. And in that platform, it was pretty clear that there was kind of a hodgepodge of different left-wing orthodoxies, but one of them was a sort of a post-colonial worldview, which identified Israel in particular as it said there, a white supremacist project, right? So in this understanding of the world is sort of divided between the white and black, ultimately, with the white oppressing blacks wherever whiteness is. The nature of whiteness is to oppress black, and the nature of blackness is oppression by whiteness. And strangely, even though it was a domestic program, Israel was singled out in a few places as what they said there was an outpost of white supremacy. Jewish liberal groups protested, and there was some back and forth about this. And I noticed in the most recent version of that platform, these references have been omitted. But at that point, when I read that and I saw that, I knew some of the sort of intellectual history behind this. I understood what sort of a movement we were dealing with. What I saw last summer was the eruption of that contingent overtaking liberalism. So liberals, which 4 years earlier had said, wait a second, I don't necessarily see myself as in common cause with all of this. I can take it on a piece by piece basis. I can say, I agree with this, but disagree with that. It became a much more programmatic, I'm just all in. I have to change my social media profile to Black Lives Matter. I cannot raise any qualms about this or that element of the movement. And by degrees, it swept through institutions. It swept through important companies. There were mass firings in companies that were not publicly supportive enough of the movement. Most chilling for me, of course, was what happened in the New York Times when the very liberal editor of the opinion pages, James Bennett, who is, as we were describing liberalism, was very interested in publishing, radical disagreement on his pages, was essentially overthrown in a coup from his writers when he decided to publish an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton. If you remember that whole occasion, that was the moment when Black Lives Matter, when that kind of wing overtook the New York Times once and for all. And it is still very, very much in the thrall of that movement and that worldview. And there's been after that, if you remember, Barry Weiss left, and then there's been less high profile people like Jennifer Senior, who has left. Liberal writers, by and large, are leaving the New York Times because they're unwelcome and because they feel unwelcome. And that's not the only institution. Even the institution I'm associated with, which is the Hartman Institute, which is the kind of the banner-carrying liberal pluralistic institution. In many ways, for example, the head of it in North America, Yehuda Kurtzer, came out in defense of the firing of James Bennett. In other words, in defense of the sort of coup that happened within the New York Times. There was, I think there still is, a very strong sense politically that if you raise reservations to the kind of victory of the movement over liberalism, you're on the wrong side of history. And there are also kind of refugees from this, right? There's a whole group of people. But because I saw how Israel was understood within that movement, I also understood that once that movement was ascendant, in very short order, Israel would become completely toxic within the left side of the spectrum.
Why?
And why did I see that, or why is that the
Why
case?
would it become toxic completely?
The analysis, as I mentioned, the analysis that movement has of Israel is as of an illegitimate white supremacist project. Now, there's a whole bunch of catchphrases that go along with that. This is an argument that was developed in the academy in the 60s and the 70s. It's colonialist, it's settler colonialist, it's ethno-supremacist, and it's and then while I've been here, two different NGOs, human rights NGOs, have come out with large reports saying that is actually an apartheid regime, not just in the West Bank over the Green Line, but within Israel proper, B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch.
Tell me, Joe, I'm going to move you along so we can get to some questions.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit, what was your experience like a couple of weeks ago after during the firing and the rockets raining down? Tell me about that experience, and what did you see from your American colleagues that you'd left?
Yeah. First, it was a little scary. I mean, I've never had missiles fired upon me before. It's a strange thing to actually, thank God for the Iron Dome system, but we had, Tel Aviv was subject to the greatest barrage of rockets in its history. Hundreds and hundreds of rockets came to Tel Aviv. I actually was, in the safe room in our house, but the window was not completely covered, and I watched the Iron Dome rockets rise up to meet the rockets coming from Gaza, and heard them exploding overhead. We didn't sleep, for about a week, because there were sirens in the middle of the night. For us, of course, it was much easier than for Israelis in the south, and not to compare, of course, any of our experiences to what people in Gaza experience, which is actually obviously horrific. But I then found myself looking on social media, and of course, this was when, as you mentioned, John Oliver and Trevor Noah, the kind of Walter Cronkites of our age to some degree, warm, fuzzy, trustworthy people, adopted the Black Lives Matter. I'm going to say Black Lives Matter is a shorthand, but this sort of, whatever you say, woke analysis of Israel. In particular, I have to say the John Oliver segment I found utterly chilling. I was just writing a second installment. There's something terrifying about watching a beloved face go cold and say, excuse my language, but I have to use the language he said, committing fucking war crimes with this kind of cold glare. It's chilling. And what I saw on my social media and from my friends was very few people raising notes of protest to this sort of thing. So
is that to say, sorry, Joe, let me push you a little bit. Is that to say there aren't war crimes being committed by Israel?
Oh, this time, it was in Gaza? Was it this particular flare up?
I mean, is that always an illegitimate? No,
I think, well, first of all, I think usually the declaration of war crimes follows an investigation, right? I mean, there's a number of factors to figure out whether or not a war crime has been committed. Israel in the past has certainly committed war crimes. However, in the struggle between Gaza and Israel, on its face, launching missiles directly at a civilian population is a war crime. I mean, there's no investigation needed for that. And putting missile installations in civilian centers is also a war crime in violation of the Geneva Convention. Israel's retaliation may, if it targeted civilians, if it didn't take all the precautions necessary to avoid civilian casualties, if it was meant to, terrorize as opposed to hit military targets, all those things would constitute war crimes. Right now, based on the evidence we have at this point, the head of UNRWA, for example, the refugee resettlement organization run by the UN for the benefit of the Palestinians, explicitly said yesterday that Israel went out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. Now, there's a huge difference here between what happened in 2014. 2014, there were over 2,000. Sure.
No, we'll never stop.
Oh, sure.
We'll never stop if we head down that path. But by the way, if anybody wants a question, raise your hand or put the question. I'm going to just ask one more question. But if anybody wants to ask,
sure. I'm sorry to go on.
No. I have to do that because of time constraints, and I want to make sure everything comes in. So, I see there's a question. Okay, we already have one. Okay, we already have a couple of questions. I was going to ask you about the rabbinical and cantorial student letter, but let's hold that on the back burner. And let me begin to open it up to the gallery.
Sure.
And let's start with Ben Chin.
Hi, Rabbi. Thanks so
Hi.
much for being with us today.
Sure.
I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are about maybe the state of things here in the United States. I mean, you expressed some sort of alarm, I suppose, at the, what's being identified as essentially unacceptable speech, right? And I mean, it seems to me there's always been unacceptable speech, right? There's always been things you can't say or can't do. That's almost always decided by those with the power to control the conversation, right? And it seems like now the people who have controlled the conversation are just kind of losing control of it, right? And other people are trying to, if not take control, at least, engage in the conversation a little bit more of a powerful way. And so it seems like right now we just don't know, right? It's just, there's no equilibrium. We've gone from a state of equilibrium where everybody kind of understood who was in control and everybody kind of understood what the rules were, to a state where we don't really quite know who's in control. And my thinking is it'll just, a new equilibrium will emerge, right? And with a new set of rules, perhaps. And maybe some of those rules will be, open up the conversation a little bit more to people who haven't been able to be part of it, right? So there is an optimistic take possible here. What's your response to that?
Well, I want to say, I agree with you. I agree with everything. Well, I'm not sure I agree with your optimistic assessment, but I agree with your analysis. This is why I don't like the phrase cancel culture. I don't use it, because you're right to say there's always a cancel culture. That is, there's always something that's within the realm of acceptable opinion and always something that's outside of it. And if what we're seeing is a shift in what's in and what's out, that's not, what's new there is not the canceling, right? And I think the most perceptive or the clearest voice on this has been Matthew Iglesias, whose Substack I subscribe to. And he said very clearly, the issue here is not, should people be canceled for saying bad things? In a certain sense, we can all agree that there are some bad things that require somebody to then go away. The question is, what are the substantive things? What are the things that are now beyond the pale? That's where the argument should take place. And I have concern about a number of things which are beyond the pale. But as I'm saying here, one of the things I worry about is what in particular this means for Jews. Now that's a narrow keyhole through which to see the whole issue in America. But I'm a Jew, and so that was where my concern lies, right? So the question to me is, for example, is support for the state of Israel, qualified however you like or unqualified however you like, is that a view that should be placed beyond the pale, outside of respectable opinion or not? If it is placed with outside of respectable opinion, I think that bodes very ill for Jews in two ways. Number one, I think it puts tremendous pressure on Jews who want to be part of the conversation to throw Israel over. And on the other hand, right, those Jews that remain sort of attached to Israel in a number of ways will be put outside of the conversation, right? That's a very tricky test. So again, that's not my whole analysis. This is, as I say, it's a keyhole. This is just one dimension of whatever sort of moral and cultural shift is happening in America. But my concern has been and remains what it means for Jews. Let me just say one more thing about that. I don't think that question is just one among many. I think that anti-Zionism is an organizing principle to a great deal of this movement, not an incidental piece of it. And therefore, the Jews are kind of squarely in the center of it. And part of why I resist the new worldview is because any worldview that organizes itself around the Jews in one way or another, other than like narrowly Jewish movements like Zionism itself, I think are bad news. Anti-Semitism as a political movement in the late 19th century was bad news. And a political ideology which puts Israel front and center as some obstacle to human happiness is a dangerous and I think misbegotten ideology.
Let's go to Mark. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi, for taking the time to meet with us.
Sure.
My question is regarding any non-Jewish allies. That can kind of help with this. So just to take a step back, when I was in college, I was very heavily involved with pro-Israel groups on campus. There were all these nonprofits that helped us, that try to get us to build relationships with other ethnic groups, other political groups, so that when BDS inevitably came to student council, we'd have support, and that failed. That failed incredibly. I was at UCLA, so at my time there, we prevented BDS from passing, but those relationships were essentially non-existent. And so now, with the migration of a lot of this campus dialogue from the campus to the mainstream, it is also manifesting itself in what we've seen over the past few weeks, where the same people who have very strongly advocated for human rights, for progressive rights of other groups, have been not only either completely silent on what's been going on, and I'm not talking about Israel, I'm talking about assaults and attacks and violence against Jews, both in the US and other countries. They have supported that. And a lot of Jews that I know are upset at that, because they were there last year with the George Floyd killing. They were there marching and protesting for all these other people for all the other rights. But when push comes to shove, no one is there that's not Jewish to support us. So what do we do to get that non-Jewish support? Because, we're still a super minority, obviously, in the US and everywhere else. Like, we can't do this on our own. History has proven we can't do this on our own. So where do we go from here with that?
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much for asking. I have to say, that's a very hard question. What do we do about it? One thing that's very troubling in this landscape is that anti-Semitism is addressed when it proves useful to the political motives of the allies that you found, right? So, the right is very, very aggressive about anti-Semitism, or what it calls anti-Semitism, when it helps them, and when it hurts them, they're not so helpful. And Jews themselves have become divided along left and right, mostly left, but some right, and they're loath to call out the anti-Semitism in their own ranks. I don't know. I don't really have an answer to you there about what practically you can do, except I think to be uncowed, to be unafraid, to speak loudly and defiantly. I think the piece that really will end up sort of, I think, damning, American Jewry is cowardice. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage, I think, to stand up to a movement, particularly when it includes people that you know and respect, or people that have influence over your livelihood and your social life. You got to go back to someone like Emil Zola during the Dreyfus affair, who risked a great deal by coming out publicly and saying, I think that these charges against Dreyfus are trumped up, and I'm standing against it. And Zola will go down in history as a righteous Gentile for doing such a thing. I think there's a lot of heroism that's called for. So I ask you, your friends, everyone, to be heroic in this case, and also to not be cowed by the volubility, by the passion that you're going to see on the other side, right? It's very scary, intimidating when people passionately come at you and say war crime, apartheid, evil. It's all called for, and there's a certain amount of toughness of standing your ground, not shouting back, but just saying, I'm defending my friends and I'm defending the Jews. That's all. I hope that's...
Raf?
Hey, Rabbi, thanks again. I had a similar kind of hard question about what to do, but I'll tailor it to what you just said around courage. Sure. So, self-identify myself first, liberal, American, conservative Jew, who wants to kind of hold the middle. What's the most constructive manifestation of courage? Like, what's the right level of engagement? And just for fodder, like you mentioned institutions, right? Media institutions that, have showed their hand and potentially their bias on some issues that we may differ on. What's the right way to engage, in terms of voting with your dollars? Obviously there's institutions like synagogues we belong to, we can move around and advocate. there are kind of multiple other engagement points. But if you're not Emile Zola, which I don't feel like I am, what does courage look like?
As I said, I do think it's great that you asked about money and institutions. I think it begins socially. Particularly, we're talking. This is a high class conservative synagogue in San Francisco. We're talking. You constitute the elite of American society, and this is happening among the elite. So I think having a certain courage socially is very important. I would look to those writers and to those voices that you think are carrying the banner. I wish I could point to certain ones in America that I think are doing a great job right now. I might get back to you on that. Let me think offhand. I have very mixed feelings about the publication Tablet magazine, which I think is all over the place and also cynical politically in lots of ways. But they at least, I think, are in good faith about some of this. I think they're worth reading and worth supporting. They don't need financial support, but they're worth reading and supporting to some degree. I guess I would say this, the movement, anti-Semitism, to the extent that anti-Zionism tips into anti-Semitism, I don't think it always is at all, but to the extent that it does, it works by hyperbole, right? It works by saying, this is the crisis that we must address. This is the worst. This is the most evil. And I think keeping a sense of perspective, which means not acquitting Israel of every charge leveled against it, but it means saying, wait a second, let's just really talk facts, numbers, comparison. Let's just speak in a rational mode here. Lowering the volume in these conversations, I think, can help sort of make things rational and reasonable again.
Amen. I think lowering the volume in all respects is what's needed in our world today. So I have a few anonymous questions that came in that I just want to throw by you. And
sure.
Call on Gary.
Sure.
So I'll throw them at you, and they come from they said, why, if Israel isn't a settler, a colonial project, did Herzl describe it as a colonial project in 1902 to Cecil Rhodes? That's the first question. Furthermore, how can you equate shouting people down for being anti-BDS or pro-Zionist with using the...
Read that last bit again. How can you
equate shouting people down for being anti-BDS or pro-Zionist with using the power of the state against pro-BDS by passing unconstitutional anti-BDS laws? And then we have one about the current issue, which is, what about Bibi Netanyahu? And isn't he fomenting strife amongst the Arabs to secure his political position? And doesn't he deserve some blame for lighting the fuse?
Great. The second one is the easiest. I mean, I think those state anti-BDS laws are probably unconstitutional, and in any case, just a terrible idea. I don't support those at all. I think an individual has the right to express themselves politically, including through boycotting and sanctioning a country. And I also think that the right of political expression includes bigotry and racism. That is, even if you think that BDS, which I do think to some degree, has anti-Semitic overtones or dimensions to it, that does not mean you don't have a constitutional right to support it. So I oppose those laws altogether.
Netanyahu.
Well, to refer to Netanyahu or the settler colonial question?
Oh, you take either one.
Look, the settler colonial question is an interesting one. Zionism is the Jews are a complicated people. We're not a people like other peoples in lots of ways. And there are dimensions of the Zionist story which certainly are colonial. I mean, when Herzl and all the early Zionists set out to do what they did, the world was divided up into empires. And to the extent you wanted to create an independent state somewhere, you had to, ingratiate yourself to colonial powers. So Herzl tried with the Ottomans, who controlled, what was then Syria, Palestine. He tried with the British. He tried with everyone that he could. He was living in the age before nationalism, so there was no such thing as independent states there. In fact, it's not clear that Herzl wanted a sovereign state, because sovereign states at that point, sovereign ethnic states, were not exactly a thing. That's a post-World War I, creation. So it certainly has a certain colonial dimension to it, necessarily. And also it's colonial in the sense that people moved from elsewhere to there, right? To that extent, if that's the definition of colonial, it's colonial. The way it's not colonial is, I think, more important than the way it is colonial, however. I mean, the people that moved there because they saw themselves as indigenous to the land. They didn't move there to extract resources and to send it to somewhere else. They didn't move there with any intention of going anywhere else. And they didn't move there with the intention of displacing. Well, this is a more controversial claim, and there's a lot of history here. But the original intention was not to displace the native, or the prior inhabitants. Herzl himself, if you read, the Jewish state, imagined a great deal of kind of Arab-Jewish cooperation. And the other piece, the really important piece is, to the extent that it's colonial, I'm willing to concede it. I think what's really meant by settler colonial, that phrase, is, first of all, European. It's not at this point a European state. The majority of Israelis don't come from Europe in their background. It's primarily a place for Jews that have been expelled from their countries of birth in the Middle East, in the Levant, in North Africa. But the other piece is, today to say colonial means illegitimate. It's a complicated way of saying illegitimate. And I don't think that Zionism, for many, many intersecting reasons, is illegitimate. So if it's merely descriptive, that is, Jews came from elsewhere and ingratiated themselves to colonial powers, yes, to some degree that's true. If it means therefore they should go back to where they came from, which is the kind of the crude version that you often hear, I reject it.
Let me hold you a little bit. Let me hold you a little bit on the
Sure.
beat question, because we're going to come back to it. But if I want to get as many participants in here as possible. So Gary has a question.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Gary.
I want to step back, and I keep thinking in these times of what Rudyard Kipling's poem said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. I think we've sort of been here before. If you look at recent history, World War II, there were Jews on either side of going whether we should get involved in the war, and that was in the United States of America. I think what concerns me most is our young people, both in Israel and here, and the lack of education, the lack of knowledge of the history of the modern state of Israel, who become knee-jerk liberals and really not having understanding. And I feel our biggest responsibility is to try and educate those young people, and at least have them affiliate with organizations that are steeped in this kind of knowledge, so that they don't stand alone and they do feel surrounded by voices of support.
I thank you for that, Gary. I think you're right. There's a lot of underinformation, poor education. I want to just make one little dissent, right? Which is that I also think there's a group of incredibly well-informed Jewish anti-Zionists who are having a very strong influence here. There's a newish magazine, kind of a reborn Jewish communist magazine called Jewish Currents, which you may know of, which has been, I think, a prime driver in the kind of the new politics. So I wouldn't necessarily attribute this to ignorance. I think there's a great deal of knowledge on the other side, but ignorance plays a part. And as I said, I think they're a minority. I as a liberal, I'm happy to have a minority, hold views that I find repugnant. I think that's fine. I do worry that in the current climate, young people in particular are intimidated, tremendously intimidated, that they don't have the knowledge to resist, and that they feel that unless they bow, they're going to lose their friends, they're going to lose their social networks. And I think we need to find a way to spare them from the feeling of intimidation, from social intimidation, to give them support, not to indoctrinate them in one direction or the other, but to let them understand that they really have a free conscience to figure things out for themselves, and to give them resources to do so.
So I thank you for saying that.
I agree with that.
Thank you for the question, Gary. I think peer pressure is a huge issue right now, especially with social media, and you actually will get canceled by your peers if you're 15 or 16. And it is, I've spoken to some that age, and I'm continuing that conversation with the Jews for Hakoko tomorrow night. It's a real issue, and having the fortitude to stand up for what you believe in the face. I mean, it's hard enough for any of us to do. Imagine being 16 or 17. I want to point out that only men have asked questions here. So I just want to note that. I don't know what that is or why that is, but Marcia has raised a question in the chat, and I'm going to come back to it now. So it's a question I think that resonates with a lot of our community here, which is we might not have, I'll tell you the joke I made. I'll tell you the joke I made. I made one Israel joke in my 3 years, Joe. One time from Johnny Dangerously, one time. The joke I made was it's probably not a great look for Israel to have the longest reigning leader in the region. Okay, that was my joke. And I think people are concerned with the prime minister. And we are a lot of us don't approve with the way he goes about business, and believe that to a certain extent, as Marcia notes, perhaps he is lighting the match here for his own political purposes. So how do you, I mean, so you're living in Tel Aviv, you vote now, you haven't voted 5 times. I'm sure, hopefully one of you.
I voted once. I voted once.
So, I mean, what do you say to Marcia and a lot of our congregants who just see Bibi and just have a hard time stomaching who he is?
Well, yeah, I share all of that. I'm proud to say I voted for the leftmost Zionist party I could vote for, which was Meretz in this last election, hoping to strengthen Yair Lapid's large coalition to build a coalition against Bibi. And I think getting Bibi out of office should be the #1 priority. Now, look, the easiest way to get Bibi out of office, and I'm sorry, this is going to cut into your membership rolls. The easiest way is for all of you to make Aliyah. And I'm sort of kidding and I'm not kidding. You know, what's interesting is how much the American Jewish conversation revolves around Israel with such passion, and did for me as well. And I think it's a testament to the fact that everyone understands that Israel is extremely important for the Jews. And I wish there were more people here that would vote against Bibi. It would help. Bibi is complicated.
We speak out as Americans? Are we allowed to speak out?
You're allowed to, but you can't vote. You know, you can't vote. At the end of the day,
can I lobby? Can I lobby? Can I send money to get Bibi out?
I think you can. I mean, we can get into all of that as well. But one thing that I think American Jews need to understand is that in a democracy, and Israel is many things, it actually is a democracy. It's not working very well, but it functions as a democracy. And it's suffering from the problems of democracy, which is that it's responsive to its constituents. And right now, Bibi doesn't care very much about American Jews. They're not going to affect his political prospects. Let me just say a few words about Bibi, right? Three things. Number one, Israel is a right-wing nation today. So even if you lose Bibi, you're going to get somebody on the right, probably, or someone further to the right than American Jews would be happy with. It's important to sort of accept that. I mean, I'm not right-wing, but Israel is right-leaning for many reasons. But the major reason, I think, is the consequences of the Second Intifada. That's the major reason in which the left really lost its last support among Israelis. That's 20 years ago now, right? But that's a major thing. So you have to reconcile yourself to that. We may not have Bibi, but we're going to have a government that's to the right, one way or the other. Other thing is, we shouldn't conflate Gaza with Bibi. Now, it's true, I think that Bibi really did set off this latest flare-up for, political calculation. But the general consensus here is that Bibi has been far less hawkish than more left-leaning prime ministers would be. Again, I'm not a fan. But when it comes to hawkishness, that's not the thing we should dislike Bibi for. Where Bibi really, really is terrible for Israel, we didn't get into any of this at all, but is really, really dangerous for Israel, is in what he's doing to the social fabric of the society. The way in which he's pitted group against group, and we haven't talked about this at all, but the Arab-Jewish riots that are happening in poor, so-called mixed cities like Lod and Ramle and also parts of Haifa, I think the kind of venom between group and group really can be traced back to the politics that Bibi has practiced for all this time. And so it's the divisiveness that we should be focusing on. It also turns out to be an incredibly successful political strategy for him. So it's the very thing that's keeping him in power. How we get him out of power, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a great deal of sort of social healing that has to happen in Israel after Bibi.
And
I just hope that
as an Israeli, you don't have any problem with us in San Francisco sending money over to sort of have people vote him out. You don't have any problem.
Hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. I hit the wrong button. You're right. Okay.
You don't have any problem for us lobbying as Americans, even though we don't live there, do you?
No, of course not. The place where I have a hard time with is with, look, I'm an American. I just made Aliyah, right? So it's hard for me to talk about you guys. It's me. It's the same thing, right? I think the piece where I get a little irritated with American Jews is the expectation that, first of all, Israel should be responsive to them in some direct way, even though they're not citizens. That is, they should do everything they can to get their voices heard there. But it's not clear to me exactly what Israel owes Americans who don't make Aliyah. Owes. That doesn't mean they shouldn't try to make their voices heard, but as a moral question, to the extent to which Israel should bow to American demands. That's number one. And the second thing, and Mari Friedman, I recommend a piece that Mari Friedman just published in The Atlantic yesterday or the day before, is the expectation that Israel will look like American Judaism. Israel is very, very different than America in tons of ways. And American Judaism looks very little like Israeli Judaism. And so we need to be less sort of ethnocentric and less parochial in trying to understand what Israel is. It doesn't look like us. And it needs to be approached really as a foreign country. That doesn't mean we need to approve everything it does, but we need to begin with the premise that they speak a language that Americans don't speak. They're under political pressure. Americans are in different history, different cultural makeup. So those are the two pieces where I get a little agitated. But when it comes to trying to influence Israel in the direction that American Jews think is healthy, please have at it.
So one final question from a female, Alana. You have your hand raised, and then we're going to thank Joe for his time because we're a little bit over.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll thank Joe at the top too. Thank you so much, Joe. I really,
Sure.
There's so much that you said that I think is important. And I loved radical disagreement doesn't need to shatter community. And I think that is, that's why we're all here. And that's what we're trying to do in this community and to hold this middle. And as I'm thinking about, we don't have the answers entirely, and it's just about keeping the conversation going. But, just something I think about is like, I have memories, our generation remembers seeing friends of our grandparents, who went through the show off. We have different associations. So no matter how we situate ourselves right now to the embrace of the privilege that we have held in our lives, we have still like the trauma that's been passed down. We still have this connection to so many things, but our kids, it's just important, I think, as parents and parents of young kids or rising up in the educational system, that we are just continue to just keep dialogue open and not be intimidated to do that, because really finding that balance between justice and also education and knowing our history, I think that's something that's going to be just upon us of my generation to make sure that we instill for our kids.
Amen.
But thank you. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. It's an appropriate, before you finish, Joe, that's an appropriate question because this is today's J Weekly. SFUSD Teachers Union endorses BDS. That is today's J Weekly. So I think your question is on point, Alana. Sorry, Joe.
No, not at all. Wow, that's very hard to see. What would I say to you? I would say two things. First of all, the phrase that's repeated most in the Torah and repeated again and again in the book of Joshua is chazak v'ametz, right? Be strong and be resilient, I think is a good way to translate that. And that's the message of Torah again and again, is stand up, right? So to the extent that you find yourself in a climate in which it's very hard to stand up, remember that it's always been hard for Jews to stand up. And stand up. That doesn't mean you have to support things you don't believe in. It just means a certain sense of pride and a sense of resilience. The other thing I would say is, just the view from here is that Israel is actually a wonderful place and a very flawed place and a place that's in a lot of trouble, internally. And it needs what it needs really is not, I think, BDS. It doesn't need more fists coming at it in one form or another. I think what it really needs is the right kind of love and attention and care, a sense that this is a society, a young society, struggling to grow and to become a decent version of itself under tremendous pressure. And to that end, I would just suggest, ask what you can. One question was what we can do in America, and my answer was not a great answer. I'll think about it more. But what you can do for Israel, I think, is support organizations that are trying to make it into a more decent version of itself. And I'm going to give the information to Dan Ain of one organization that's very close to my heart. It's going to say one quick pitch about it. There's an organization here called Shacharit. And its premise is Israel is made up of a great deal of diversity. Just to name some, there's religious and secular Jews. There are Jews from Europe and there are Jews from the Middle East. There are Arabs and Jews. There are right-wingers and left-wingers. And these people all entertain a fantasy of dominating the other. And the message of Shacharit is they're all going to have to figure out how to live together in a shared society, right? Across tremendous difference, as Alana just said, across real difference. And it tries to defeat fantasies of domination and to find ways for these different groups to partner into building a more just and a more cooperative society in which Arab and Jew and religious and secular and right and left coexist without trying to destroy one another. It's an amazing organization, Shacharit. And so I suggest that you support them and learn about their work. And I'll send Dan information for how you can support them financially, but I'll also send some information from them. But that kind of message, right? Rather than fight against Israel or condemn it until it conforms to your vision of what it ought to be, to help it grow from within, to become healthy and a home for all those that live in it is what I would urge you to do.
I just want to thank Rabbi Schwartz. Thank you for taking your time out. I know it's like 11 at night in Tel Aviv, but this was a serious, hard conversation. Hard to hear and think about a lot of this stuff. It's very hard to hear about what you've gone through. It's hard to hear about what the Palestinians are going through, and it's hard to reconcile that for a lot of us. So we cherish your time and the conversation, and I love the framing of the radical disagreement, but yet staying together as a community. That is what we aspire to, and I think we've achieved a little portion of that this afternoon. So thank you for doing that, and I just want to wish you and your family safety and security. And hopefully this is a conversation, well, it's certainly one that we're going to continue in our community going forward, but hopefully we can continue to engage you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all.